She was already dressed in white when the day began. Hair pinned, veil straight, flowers in her hands. Everything she had planned for, everything she had imagined since she was a little girl, was finally happening. The venue was full. The music was playing. The man she loved was standing at the end of that aisle waiting for her. And she walked toward him. She said the words. She signed the papers. She smiled in every photograph. By all accounts, it was a perfect day. But sometime in the next 24 hours, before the flowers wilted, before the cake was finished, before the guests had even made it home, she was gone. Not gone the way newlyweds go. Not off on a honeymoon. Not asleep in a hotel room. Gone. Vanished. Missing. And the man she had just married? He had no idea where she was. Or at least, that's what he said. To understand what happened to her, you have to understand who she was before that day. She wasn't just a bride. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was the kind of woman people described the same way over and over no matter who you asked. Warm. Dependable. Someone who showed up. Someone who remembered your birthday, who called when you were having a hard time, who never made you feel like a burden. She had built a life for herself quietly and carefully. She had a job she was proud of. A small circle of friends she trusted completely. A family that, for all its complications, loved her deeply. She had not rushed into this relationship. She had taken her time. She had asked the right questions, or at least she thought she had. When she introduced him to her family, they were cautious, the way families always are when someone new arrives. But over time, the reservations softened. He seemed stable. He seemed devoted. He seemed like exactly the kind of man who would take care of her. The engagement came after roughly 2 years together. She said yes without hesitation. The wedding planning was stressful, as wedding planning always is. There were disagreements about the guest list. There were budget conversations that went longer than they should have. There were a few moments, looking back, that people would later describe differently than they did at the time. But that is the thing about hindsight. It changes the color of everything. On the morning of her wedding day, she woke up early. She was anxious, but in the way brides are supposed to be anxious. Excited. Nervous about the ceremony, about the vows, about standing in front of everyone she loved and making a promise she intended to keep forever. She sat in that chair while someone did her hair and her makeup. She laughed with her bridesmaids. She had a glass of champagne and said she needed to slow down or she'd cry before she even got to the church. By the time she put on that dress and looked in the mirror, every person in that room said the same thing. She looked radiant. She looked happy. And then she walked down that aisle and she became a wife. The reception was held at the same venue, in a room just beyond the ceremony hall. There were speeches. There was dinner. There was dancing. People who were there that evening describe it the way you'd expect. Festive, loud, emotional. The kind of event where time moves strangely, where you look up and realize 3 hours have passed. She made her rounds. She hugged people. She held her husband's hand during the first dance. But somewhere in that evening something shifted. Not dramatically. Not the way it would look in a movie. It was subtle. Small. The kind of thing you only notice when you're looking back and you're already looking for something wrong. A few guests would later recall that she seemed quieter than expected after dinner. That she stepped outside at some point and was gone longer than you'd think to go get some air. That when she came back in, her smile looked different. Still present, still polished, but sitting somewhere behind her eyes instead of in front of them. Her maid of honor would later say she pulled her aside near the end of the evening and asked if everything was okay. She said yes. She said she was just tired, that it had been a long day, that she'd feel better once they got to the hotel. That was the last real conversation anyone had with her. Sometime after 11 o'clock that night, she left the reception. There is some dispute about exactly when. There is some dispute about exactly how. What is not in dispute is that she left without telling her new husband. Without telling her family. Without saying goodbye to a single person still in that room. She simply walked out. And she did not come back. Her husband noticed she was gone around midnight. He assumed at first that she had stepped outside again or gone to the restroom, or found herself in a long conversation with a relative somewhere in the venue. He waited. He checked the obvious places. He sent a text. No response. He waited a little longer. He called. It rang through to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail again. By the time he started asking other people if they had seen her, the staff was already beginning to break down the event space. The last guests were filtering out. The parking lot was emptying. No one had seen her leave. Or rather, no one had noticed her leaving. There is a difference. Her phone, when investigators later examined its data, showed that it had been powered down sometime around 11:15 that night. Not a dead battery. Not a dropped call. It was turned off deliberately by human hands. Her car was still in the venue parking lot. She had not called a rideshare. She had not used her bank card. She had not passed in front of the one exterior security camera trained on the main entrance at the time she would have walked out. She was there. And then she wasn't. Her husband called her parents just after 1 in the morning. He tried to keep his voice level, he would later say. He tried not to alarm them. He told them he thought maybe she had just needed some space, that maybe she'd driven herself somewhere to clear her head. But her car was still in the parking lot. Her mother called the police at 1:47 in the morning. The initial response was careful. Law enforcement began with the basics. They reviewed what surveillance footage existed. They canvassed the venue and the surrounding area. They took statements from the husband, from the wedding party, from the event staff. Everyone said the same things in slightly different ways. She seemed happy. She seemed fine. Nobody saw her leave. Nobody had any reason to think anything was wrong. Except that she was gone. And as investigators began to pull on individual threads, the picture that emerged was more complicated than a missing bride. The first thread was the phone. Turned off at 11:15, approximately 45 minutes before her husband reported noticing she was gone. That gap alone raised questions. If she had simply stepped out for air, she would have needed her phone. If she had planned to leave, turning off the phone was intentional. And if it was intentional, she had made a decision, or someone had made one for her. The second thread was the guest accounts. When investigators went back to the witnesses and pressed for more detail, the consistent portrait of a happy bride began to develop texture. One guest mentioned seeing her in what appeared to be a tense, low-voiced exchange near the back of the reception hall approximately an hour before she disappeared. The guest could not hear what was said. They could not identify who she was speaking with. But they remembered the look on her face. It did not look like the face of a happy bride. The third thread was the marriage itself. Investigators, as they always do in cases involving a missing spouse, turned their focus toward the husband. What they found was not a monster, not at first glance. He was cooperative. He was visibly distressed. He gave his statement willingly and without apparent hesitation. He answered every question he was asked. But answers can be accurate and still be incomplete. And there were things he had not volunteered. There had been problems in the relationship. This is not a revelation that came from strangers. It came from people who loved them both, people who had no interest in seeing either of them hurt, people who only spoke because a woman was missing and they felt they had no choice. There had been arguments. Not the ordinary friction of two people building a life together, but arguments of a different quality, loud, sudden, occasionally physical in ways that left marks that could be explained away but not entirely forgotten. She had spoken about it once to her maid of honor. She had minimized it the way people often do, the way you do when you love someone and you want to believe that what happened was an exception rather than a pattern. She had said she was handling it. She had said things were getting better. She had not said she was afraid. But there had been a conversation about 3 weeks before the wedding that investigators would come to regard as significant. She had reached out to a domestic violence resource line. The call lasted 11 minutes. She had not left him. She had not told her family. She had walked back down the aisle toward him 3 weeks later in a white dress. People who have never been in that situation often ask why. They ask it as if the answer should be simple. As if love and fear don't occupy the same space in a person's chest. As if leaving is always available as an option just because it seems obvious from the outside. She had her reasons. We may never know all of them. What we do know is that she made a phone call 3 weeks before the wedding. And then she got married anyway. And then, sometime after 11 o'clock on the night of her wedding, she walked out of a reception hall and disappeared. And for 9 days, nobody knew where she was. And then a truck driver on a rural highway in a state 400 miles away pulled over to the side of the road. And he found her. And she was not alive. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A stretch of highway that most people never use, that doesn't appear on tourist maps, that locals know mainly as the long, flat road you take when you're trying to get somewhere faster than the interstate allows. A woman, found in a drainage ditch set back from the shoulder. Still in her wedding dress. Not torn. Not scattered. Carefully placed. That detail, carefully placed, is the one that would stay with every investigator who worked this case for the rest of their careers. Whoever left her there had taken their time. There was no sign of struggle at the scene, no evidence of a vehicle leaving the road in a panic. She had been set down deliberately, in that ditch 412 miles from the venue where she had danced with her new husband fewer than 10 days earlier. She still had her wedding ring on. The medical examiner's findings would not be released in full for several weeks. But the cause of death, when it came, was not what most people expected. It was not blunt force. It was not a shooting. It was not the kind of violence that announces itself. She had been poisoned. A slow-acting compound, one that would not have produced obvious symptoms immediately. One that, if you were watching her that evening at the reception, might have looked like tiredness. Like a bride who had had a long day. Like a woman who just needed some air. The timeline reconstructed by the medical examiner suggested she had been given the substance sometime during the reception itself. While the speeches were being made. While the cake was being cut. While everyone who loved her stood in that room and celebrated what they believed was the beginning of her life. Someone at that wedding had poisoned her. And then they had taken her body across 4 state lines and left her in a ditch in a dress she would never take off. This is where the case stopped being a missing persons investigation and became something else entirely. Multi-jurisdictional. Multi-agency. The kind of case that gets a task force, a dedicated tip line, and a name, because cases with names get more resources, and detectives knew from the beginning that they were going to need every resource available. They started with the guest list. 214 people had attended that wedding. Every single one of them was interviewed. Every alibi was checked. Every relationship to the bride and groom was mapped, documented, and examined. And that is when investigators found the first crack. 12 guests on that list shared a connection that had not been disclosed during the initial investigation. 12 people in that room were connected, through business, through money, through a network of financial arrangements that should never have existed, to the groom. Not to the couple. To the groom alone. Investigators began pulling financial records. What they found changed the entire shape of the case. He was not who he had said he was. The name he gave her when they met, the name on their marriage certificate, was not the name he was born with. The job he told her he had was real, but it was a front. The apartment they shared had been rented under a third name, a name attached to an identity that had been constructed carefully over several years. He was a man who had built himself from scratch. And the question investigators now had to answer was why, and who else knew? It took 11 days from the discovery of her body to the first arrest. It was not the husband. That is the twist that nobody saw coming. Not the media. Not the family. Not the investigators who had been quietly building a case against him for over a week. The first arrest was a woman. She was 43 years old. She had been at the wedding. She had sat in the third row during the ceremony. She had hugged the bride and told her she looked beautiful. Her name appeared on the seating chart as a colleague of the groom, someone from his professional life, someone the bride had met twice before the wedding and found perfectly pleasant. She was, in fact, none of those things. She was his wife. Not his ex-wife. His wife. A woman he had married 7 years earlier in a private ceremony in another state, a woman from whom he had never been divorced, a woman who had known about the new relationship, about the engagement, about the wedding, and had not tried to stop it. She had attended it. She had sat in the third row, and she had watched him marry another woman, and she had smiled, and then sometime during the reception she had found her way close enough to the bride's drink to make sure the evening ended the way they had planned for it to end. Because this had been planned. Not by him alone. Not by her alone. Together. The motive, when investigators finally assembled it, was cold and precise and devastating in its simplicity. The bride had money. A trust fund, established by her late father, that she had never spoken about publicly and that was set to transfer fully into her name upon her marriage. Approximately $2.4 million. She had married him, and in doing so, had made him the beneficiary of that account in the event of her death. They had known about it before he met her. The introduction had not been accidental. The relationship had not been spontaneous. The 2 years he spent earning her trust, her love, her family's approval, all of it had been a construction. A long, patient, deliberate plan built around a woman who had done nothing wrong except trust someone who had decided before they even met her that she was worth more dead than alive. Once investigators had the first arrest, the rest came quickly. Financial records, phone records, hotel receipts, a prepaid card used to purchase the compound found in her system. The evidence assembled itself the way evidence does in cases where the perpetrators believed they were too careful to leave any. They were not careful enough. The compound had been sourced through a connection that could be traced. The vehicle used to transport her body had been rented under the false identity, the same false identity that had started to crack the moment investigators ran the name against federal databases. He was arrested on a Thursday afternoon, 14 days after the wedding. He did not resist. He did not speak. He sat in the back of a law enforcement vehicle and stared out the window at nothing, and he did not say a single word until his attorney arrived. He has not said much since. His wife, The woman from the third row cooperated. She talked. Whether she did it out of remorse or self-preservation is a question only she can answer. But she talked, and what she said filled in every gap investigators had not yet been able to close. She described the plan in detail. When it began. How they chose her. How they tracked her finances. How he built the relationship step by step according to a timeline they had discussed together. She described the night of the wedding, what she put in the glass, how they moved the body afterward, who drove and who didn't. She described all of it like she was giving a deposition, flat and factual, without visible emotion. She received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony. He did not. The family found out almost everything in the wrong order. They found out she was dead before they found out why. They found out about the trust fund before they found out about the false identity. They found out he had been married before they found out he had been lying from the moment he introduced himself. Her mother, in a statement released through the family's attorney, said only this, that her daughter had spent her whole life being kind to people, and that the world had used that kindness against her, and that she hoped every single person who sat in that courtroom understood what had been taken from them. That statement was read aloud during the sentencing hearing. He did not react. The trust fund, which had technically transferred upon the marriage, was frozen by court order immediately following the arrests. After extensive litigation, it was returned to the estate and redistributed according to the late father's original intent. Not a dollar of it went to either of them. That was the one small piece of justice the family received before the trials began. The trials themselves were long, complicated, fought hard by defense attorneys who challenged every piece of forensic evidence, every link in the financial chain, every word of his wife's testimony. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They came back with guilty on all counts for both defendants. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. She was sentenced to 47 years. Neither of them will leave prison. She walked down that aisle on a Saturday morning believing in something real. She believed in the man standing at the end of it. She believed in the life they were going to build. She believed, the way most of us do when we love someone, that the person in front of her was who they appeared to be. She was wrong. And it cost her everything. But here is what they could not take from her, no matter how precisely they planned it, no matter how carefully they executed it. They could not take the fact that people loved her. Really loved her, not for what she was worth on paper, not for what she could provide, but for who she actually was. The woman who showed up. The woman who remembered. The woman who stood in front of a mirror in a white dress and looked, for one morning, exactly as happy as she deserved to be. They could not take the fact that she was found. That justice was pursued. That the people who chose to treat her life as a transaction were made to answer for that choice in a court of law, in front of a jury, in front of her family, in front of the world. And they could not take the fact that we are still talking about her. Because that is what these stories are really about. Not the perpetrators. Not the courtroom drama. Not the twist that nobody saw coming. Those things matter, but they are not the point. The point is her. The point is that she existed. That she mattered. That what was done to her was wrong in a way that does not diminish with time or distance or the long bureaucratic grind of the legal system. She deserved her wedding day. She deserved her life. She deserved to take off that dress and wake up the next morning and begin whatever came next. She did not get any of those things. But she got the truth. And the people who took everything else from her could not take that. Rest wherever you are. You were worth so much more than they decided.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.